Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the CyberPod with me, Tariq. And
Kash.
so this is episode 11, also known as Governance, Risk and Compliance, and it's the second part of our roadmap series, right? So here we're going to talk about the fun topic that is governance, risk and compliance, which feeds in nicely to the phase one, the foundational stuff for the security program. So let's dive straight into it. What is governance, risk and compliance?
So governance, risk and compliance, if you talk to cyber people, use the term GRC. We all know what it means. We all dread it. So this is the first step, we believe, to establishing your cybersecurity team and function, because it tells you how to keep things on track using governance, understand and navigate your risk using the risk function, and make sure you are following the relevant rules and regulations that apply to your sector and your business using the compliance stage. So jumping into that, governance.
Yeah, governance. I mean, so that is very much the leadership, right? The strategic side of things. And when you talk about different aspects of risk programs, people often use terms like tactical and strategic. Tactical is the short-term snappy fixes. Okay, we've got a problem. What are we going to do about it? Strategy, strategic. These are like medium to long-term programs that we're going to build. So, from a governance perspective, it's very much what are we doing here? So, this is our business. These are the things that we do. These are the services that we offer. So we need these sort of policies in place. So we need to make sure that this kind of activity is prohibited. Our staff are aware of these things. So there's a clear set of roles and responsibilities. And then that way you've got something to work against. Otherwise, people are going to join the business. People are going to leave. That's natural for organizations. But somebody new joins and they say, what's allowed here? What isn't allowed here? What do we do? There's no policy, no standard. People will sort of make things up as they go along and figure things out for themselves. So actually you need something that people can baseline against and go, that's what we're supposed to be doing here.
And it's also leadership's role to say, these are our company's objectives, and aligning those security objectives to those company objectives. So it's not security run solo. They align with the business as a whole.
Yeah. And I think a couple of terms always come in here, which, whenever I get involved with GRC, annoy me as much as anyone else. So if you're coming out of this outside of cyber, will definitely make no sense to you. But things where it comes like standard, policy, framework, all of these different terms, you think, what's the difference? But often somebody will come with a standard or they'll come with a strategy. And, the senior leadership will say, I want to do this. Well, to actually achieve that, what do we do to achieve that? I don't know. The technical team can figure it out. I want to safeguard our data everywhere. That's our strategy. We're going to safeguard our data. But what does that actually mean? How do we do that? And so that's where you can have policies and you can have actual documents that say, okay, in our AWS system, we need to have these features enabled. And we need to be logging and monitoring for this specific activity so that we can achieve the strategy.
And those are your standards.
And there you go. And I think when we talk about things like transparency and reporting and etc., it's having that leadership meeting where you're constantly reviewing the policies, the standards, the frameworks, what people are doing, and saying, okay, this is what we want you to be doing. And this is what we're missing. This is what we have in place. You're almost performing like a gap analysis. You're saying, what are we missing? What have we got? And is that effective for what we need here?
And making sure things stay on track.
Yeah.
So where are you in terms of your timelines? What are the hurdles that have come or that you didn't foresee that have come in place? And how do you overcome those? From a leadership point of view, it's your job to make sure you understand those and make those decisions to keep the project teams on track.
Awesome. Yeah, and that leads us nicely into, if you don't stay on track, you have a big risk.
Yeah, and risk is a big part of any organization. Sometimes risk is implemented before governance. Probably not the right way of doing things, but it happens when people are just winging it. They say, this is the risk to our business. They do it even without having a risk management process. They say, oh, this is the risk to our business. We need to do X, Y, and Z, and it helps people prioritize work. Yeah. But when you have a proper risk management process, then you understand the risks to the business as a whole, not just that individual project that you're focusing on. And it also allows you to deal with them effectively. So you're looking at, can you avoid this risk, as in fix it and mitigate the problem? Do you transfer the risk and send it over to a managed service provider to deal with? For example, your security team only works 9 to 5. You have no monitoring out of hours. That's a risk. How do you transfer that to somebody? Is you get a managed service provider to do 24/7 monitoring for you. Or you risk accept it to say, okay, we can't mitigate this. The chances of it being exploited are quite low. We mitigated that. Or you put in some controls to limit the risk, to say, okay, we've limited it. This is the residual risk, and we now risk accept that.
Yeah, awesome.
So and the final thing, and I've already touched on it, is it helps people prioritize the tasks and the resources needed for working on something, because you can't do everything, right? But you say, okay, we have these 10 risks. This number 1 here is our biggest priority. We need to get this done. Number 10 is like a low priority risk, and we can ignore that one. So it helps you prioritize where you use your resource to fix the most critical things to your business.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a language that everyone can understand, right? It's, you're not necessarily going in there and talking real technical, real, sophisticated terms. It's very much, if we don't do this, this can happen. And there is this level of likelihood, this level of impact. And these are things that everyone gets and says, okay, that's a big deal. Or, okay, that's a problem, but that, it informs you about what risk action to take. You look at it and say, that is a ridiculous risk. We cannot accept that level of risk. We're going to have to take action. Or it's a risk, but we can't really avoid it. And actually, it's a risk that everyone in the industry faces. I'm going to give an example of this. We would go through and look at, all the organization and say things like, well, okay, there's a risk that, our server goes down. We can, mitigate that risk by adding in some redundancy and some availability to that. Fine. There's a risk that the economy crashes. Okay, but I can't do anything about that. So it's a risk. We note it. We're aware of it. We have some level of contingency in place, but I can't control the economy of the country. Liz Truss might, but that didn't go so well. But
I think you touched on 2 very important words there. So when you're doing a risk analysis or you're going through that risk management process, the 2 things that you want to highlight is the likelihood and the impact. Once you know those, then you can prioritize.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's taking the time to actually look at that, which helps you then prioritize and make those informed decisions. And if you're not prioritizing it yourself, other factors might come in and actually make you prioritize that.
I think we're moving on to the next.
Yeah, and that's where
compliance.
Yeah, compliance is the big one, because I think there are certain things when it comes to things like money, or when it comes to the general survival of a business, that most people within the business will take seriously. And they say, okay, if there's an effect to our revenue, everyone in that room is going to take it seriously. Whereas if it's something that's not one of those primary factors, people might say, okay, let's deprioritize that. That's not a big deal. Step forward compliance, because compliance tells you, no, that is a big deal. And data security is a really big example of this, where it's been almost talked down in boardrooms or in these leadership discussions of, okay, we should be looking after our customer data, but it's not the biggest priority. Okay, every 3 or 4 years we leak a bit of sensitive data, but we're a big brand. The customers aren't going to go anywhere. Like, they're going to still keep their accounts with us, But our site going down, that's a problem. So we're going to make sure the site stays up. But if the site gets hacked and we lose some data out of it,
yeah, like you said, for big organizations, when with the older DPA pre-GDPR, the fine was, I think, maximum fine was 500,000. Yeah. It's pocket change to a $1 billion company. So
it costs them more to actually put the security in place.
Exactly. Yeah. So the risk is, we lose £500,000 fine, bit of reputational damage, but we rebuild that. It's worth it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's where, like you said, the compliance side has come in to beef up the enforcement, right? And so depending on the industry or sector that you're in, or the area that your organization is based in, will determine what compliance frameworks that are relevant to you. So from like a industry regulation perspective, you're in the finance industry, or you're processing payment card details, something like PCI DSS, payment card industry data security standards. Oh man, will be coming into, but will be relevant to you, and that's something that you're going to have to meet. And if you don't meet, it affects your ability to process payment card information. So first there's a fine, the next step is another fine, next step they're going to start stopping you from being able to process payment cards. So then you start going, okay, that's a big problem for us. So we need to follow the requirements in there. And there's things in there around, okay, you need to do pen testing over certain periods, and you need to have proper identity and access management in place. These are things that people might have deprioritized before and gone, we'll get round to access management at some point. But, oh no, actually it's going to affect our ability to run the business. So we now have to take it seriously. Similarly, things like you said, you mentioned DPA, the Data Protection Act, it's no longer just a flat fine. There's also a percentage of, your annual revenue, which, can be quite significant for some of these organisations.
Which hurts a lot more.
Yeah, that one will hurt a little bit more. So yeah, I think that's the GRC side of things, right? You've got what you're doing, or like what you're articulating as an organisation from your leadership team of, this is the strategic direction we want to go in. You've got the risk side of things of, which is helping to inform you about, should we do this? Should we do this? What kind of decisions we make? And then you've got the compliance going. You don't forget about this. You need to also take that seriously.
Make sure you prioritize this. Yeah. So I think it's quite clear for anyone listening that GRC applies to businesses of all sizes. I think it's ignored a lot in the smaller organizations because everyone's running full speed to get things working.
Sure.
But it needs to be there. And as you grow from startup to small business, you need to start taking this a lot more seriously.
Yeah, definitely.
So now the next question is, who performs this role? And in a small business, unfortunately, it ends up being usually because of budget constraints, and also it's a smaller team, so there's generally less to do. I say, but you're always busy. Work never runs out. But essentially, it's done by a GRC lead or a GRC manager who comes in and reports directly to the leadership team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But then, like you said, when you move into more of the larger side of things, you got a bit more resource, you got a bit more head count. You start thinking, okay, we can split out the roles a bit more. So what do these roles look like? You might have a governance manager or a director or a CISO, so a Chief Information Security Officer. I don't know exactly when CISOs became popular, but they're a fairly newish kind of role. Everyone's familiar with the standard C-suite, the CEO, the CFO, the COOs, those kind of roles. The CISO's been more of a, last sort of decade or so, I think it's grown a lot more.
I think even then, in a lot of companies, you had the CISO reporting into the CTO, which is the Chief Technical Officer. Whereas now they're getting their own seat on the board. Yeah,
and I think one of the key aspects to distinguish there is that the main point of a CISO, and the only way you can be successful as a CISO, is if you're impartial, right? You have to look at the security side of things. The same way that the CFO has to look at the money side of things, okay? They have to be concerned with, we still need to keep the lights on. We need to keep bringing money in. The CISO can't say, okay, this is a problem, but we've got bigger issues across the business, so let's ignore them. It's no, these are the information security problems.
They're the champions for security.
We need to make sure that they are being heard and understood in that room, because if not, my head's on the chopping board here. I'm the one that has to explain why we've just ignored these 20 things because we didn't have time.
And you're accountable to the regulator as the CISO. You are the top ladder of security. So when things go wrong with your analysts not doing the right thing because they don't have the right tooling or the right budget, and things are missed and your customer data's leaked, as the CISO, you're the one who's being held accountable for all of this.
Definitely. And that's why often, if you're on the smaller or medium side of things, you might not have the budget or the resources to have a dedicated CISO, but you might start looking at, the virtual CISO market is growing a lot more, and it's, okay, can we bring in somebody that has the experience across, the industry, across multiple areas to perform that role for us? And actually, sometimes that's more beneficial because they then can truly be an independent third party. They're not having someone sort of tying their hand a little bit and saying, oh yeah, but can you raise that next month rather than this month because we've got some big priorities. Now that's their job. That's what they've been hired to do. That's their remit. They're going to be that impartial third party that you need. And when it comes to things like audits, there's always this distinction between, well, what kind of audit did you do, an internal audit or an external audit? Because if you do an internal audit, people are less likely to take that as truthfully.
You marked your own homework.
You marked your own homework. That's the perfect analogy there, right? So, I've had it before where I've done auditing and people have said to me, yeah, we're going to fix that next week. So you can just mark that as done because by next week it'll be done. I'm like, right now it's not done, so it's not getting marked as done now.
Or they say it's done, and you say, "Show me, where's the proof, where's the evidence?" And
yeah.
surprisingly, they don't have it.
Yeah, it's on the other laptop. I thought you're a cloud-based organization. No, it's on a server in a different country. But yeah, so ultimately that CISO or that director, governance manager, they're the one outlining the strategy. But then you're going to have like a risk analyst, a manager, or a risk director, somebody that's actually going to implement that. So they're going to take the strategy from the person above and say, how are we going to actually enforce this? So they're going to look at things like risk assessments. So often one of the most powerful things you can do is a business impact analysis, or a BIA. And it's actually saying, okay, for each risk area, what's the likelihood of it happening? What's the impact if it does happen? That gives you some sort of scoring mechanism to go, okay, there is this residual risk. Okay, now we can put some sort of we can make a risk-based decision here, and if we do this, it might mitigate it by a certain amount, but it doesn't mitigate it completely. Or it could do, but most of the time it doesn't mitigate completely. So then you have this thing called like a mitigation offset. So you still have a residual risk that you still need to take into account and look into. And so that's the job of the risk analyst or this risk manager to, communicate back into the CISO that, okay, we've done the analysis. We know that these are the top risks. We prioritized them. We're going to take these actions to try and mitigate them. But in doing so, we still have this area of residual risk. So then that way, the CISO can inform the rest of the board that, okay, we've done stuff about it, but we're still carrying this level of risk. Like we haven't just resolved them all. And I think that's often the most naive way of looking at security is, okay, well, if I do these 10 things, I'm good, right? I can just close this program off and we're fine. It's like, no, you've reduced the risk, but you haven't stopped it from happening. Like it could still happen. So I think that's the key job there between those two stakeholders is to, implement the strategy and then feed back in, how that process has actually gone. And then you've got the more of the, compliance analyst, so like the information security compliance perspective. So it's looking at more of the legal side of things, right? So, what are the actual compliance frameworks that we need to align to? What are the periods that are relevant to us? So if we have to submit something, when do we have to submit it by? If we have to get an external auditor in, when does that need to happen? Making sure this is all scheduled and all flowing nicely. And so then that way you can book things like your internal audit, because the external auditor will want to see the internal auditor's work because they want to know and have some confidence that your internal auditor is being fair, is covering the right scope. They have some confidence that the internal auditor is doing the correct job here. And so, like you said, marking your own homework. If the internal auditor is finding the same stuff as the external auditor, there's a lot more confidence that the internal auditor is doing a thorough job there.
And it means you can be more confident when you go to an external auditor that you will pass.
Exactly. Because, there's a cost aspect to failing these compliance audits is that, obviously you have to retest. There's the financial aspect of that. But then there's the time aspect. You thought that, okay, I've been communicated that there is X date that we're going to go for from this compliance perspective. And everyone internally is telling me that everything's done, everything's fine. The internal audit was a success. So no problems. We're going to pass on this particular date. So everyone's planned around that date being successful. But actually, if the internal auditor hasn't been thorough enough, the
External comes in, finds things, and then you have to then use resource to fix those. So there's that overhead cost that you haven't accounted for as well.
Exactly. And all of these different stakeholders, they feed back into the CISO. And that's why I think, like I mentioned about the CISO role growing in prominence, is that, for that function to work well, you need those different personalities. You need those different people performing the activities that the CISO can go into that room with the confidence and the knowledge that, okay, this is our current status and this is where we are good enough.
And I think this highlights how big of a responsibility the GRC lead or manager in a small organization has. They are doing all of these job roles and functions that you find in a big organization all by themselves. They're wearing, I count, 10 different hats.
Yeah.
Just within governance, risk and compliance, they're doing the analyst work, they're doing the manager work, they're doing the lead work, they're doing the CISO work within all the three sub teams, including the internal auditor work and working with the external auditor.
Yeah.
So it's a huge role and a huge bit of responsibility, and it's very, very important.
Definitely. So I'm going to put you on the spot here for a second, because I'm a small business owner. I'm looking at this situation. I'm saying, right, okay, so I clearly need to take GRC very seriously here, but I don't have the ability to hire 7 people, right? So how can I look at potential candidates, ask them the right questions to understand if they're capable of, doing these multiple jobs, so that this is going to be a successful program? So what are the sort of things I should be asking?
I think it's not just what are you asking, it's about asking open-ended questions so you can see in their answer the experience. If they've done it before, they'll be able to pick up on it and elaborate on these open-ended questions, whereas somebody who's fairly new or has sat in a room where somebody else is doing the work, they may not be able to answer the questions as well.
That's a really good question. Oh, sorry, really good point you made there, because when I have done auditing, that was the first piece of advice I was given for auditing: is never ask close-ended questions when you're doing an audit. Because if I say to you, you've got an encryption standard, haven't you? You know the answer is yes or no, and you know based on how I've structured that question that you probably should have one of those. And so in the back of your mind, you're going, yes, I've got it. And under the table, you're texting somebody in the team and saying, we need an encryption standard by 2 p.m. now, because they're going to ask for it. Whereas actually, what I should be doing is saying to you, okay, so, how do you safeguard data across your organization? What do you do about that? And so I'm laying the burden of information on your feet to say, well, this is what we do for it. Okay. And so then that way I can note down the shortcomings that you potentially have without almost telling you. It's the same thing with interviews. You don't want to be spoon feeding someone the credit. You've done this before, haven't you? You've done this before as well. Yes or no? Just agree to everything. I've done it all. I'll figure it out when I get the job.
Yeah. And I think we'll do a blog series on these, including the questions we would ask. But I'll give a couple of examples. You're looking at somebody who's implemented policies and procedures. So you ask them, what policy procedures have you created from scratch? Talk me through them. How did you ensure that they were followed by the employees when they were rolled out? So making sure they're not just documents that sit on a shelf once they've been created. You have the InfoSec policy. You need to make sure everyone's seen it. So do you have a HR process where somebody reads the policy and signs off saying, I've read this. Now then, if they don't adhere to it, you can then hold them accountable. Mm-hmm. That also comes into it. Something like, in your experience, how do you ensure that governance is maintained in an organization with limited resources? So especially if they say they come from a small organization where they've implemented governance processes. Tell me about it.
Yeah.
Just whenever they say, I've done this, you say, okay, tell me about it.
Talk to me about it. I think it's the most powerful phrase you can use in an interview, in an audit, in just general conversation. Talk to me about it.
But you also want to make sure that they have the basics. So say, what's the risk management process? You have a defined answer that you're looking for. If they've done risk long enough, they'll be able to tell you through the different steps within the risk management process. That's it. I think we'll hold the big questions for the blog post.
Yeah.
I don't want to just read them off and then somebody will listen to them and then forget them. And
Scrambling.
try-
Scrambling. I'm like, this is gold dust. Slow down. Yeah. No, definitely. But then I think the next point then comes into, okay, so you've tried to hire someone for that role. You've tried to find the right person to build out that GRC function that you didn't have before. Now, how do we actually measure success? Because
It's a big point.
Yeah, because
Very big.
measuring success is very easy when you have a mature program.
This also goes back to the governance bit.
Yeah.
So you're measuring success. You're tracking the work that's being done.
For sure. You have something to compare against. You have something to say, okay, well, this is how it looked for the last few years. This is how we're looking this year. We can look at it from a qualitative perspective. We can look at it from a quantitative perspective. Cool. But if it's a new program or it's a new function, you don't really have those, metrics or factors to compare against. So it's very much you've got to set things up that you're going to track. And so that sort of first 3 to 6 months, I think I'll go back to this tactical versus strategic thing, right? It's okay, you're coming in new to a function. You're probably not going to deliver me, instant things overnight. I'm not going to expect to see things in the first week or 2 weeks. That person needs time to figure out what's going on across the organization, figure out how everything fits together. And so you're giving them a bit of time to do this. So in that 3 to 6, it's more of the strategic side of things, right? And you're saying, okay, how do we get the basics right here? So the basics are the tactical side, and then where are we going to take this forward after we get those basics right for the more strategic side? So essentially that person should be coming to you with, clear plans, clear roadmaps, a clear, for want of a better term, gap analysis. Gap analysis is one of the most common things you do when you first look at an organization, because you say, okay, this is what good looks like, either from a compliance perspective or from an industry benchmark perspective. This is what we should be doing from a GRC perspective. We're currently doing this. Okay, so actually, how do we get from that small subset to the industry level or the compliance base, benchmark? And so
that's where your roadmap comes in, right? So you've done this is what good looks like. This is where we are. You understand your gap. You've got your gap analysis. Now you build your roadmap around those gaps to say, this is how we're going to get from where we are to where we're going.
Definitely. And something you touched on before was around things like the policy side of things. So actually, you've got nothing in place here, but you need something that people across the organisation can actually now use to say, this is how we should be doing things. So, are there, security, risk and compliance policies up to standard? Do they exist? If not, they're going to need to be created. And so you're going to need to get the strategy of the organisation to be articulated in these documents so that they're all feeding into the same strategic direction. Okay, if we achieve these policies and people follow those policies, we will be meeting the strategic secure direction.
Aligning security to the business.
Exactly. And then that way you help it be an enabler. That way, by following that, you're doing what the business wants you to do. And so the next step is all about the risk management, right? So you've got some sort of risk management process. You've got a business impact analysis. You've got something.
You hope, maybe.
Yeah. But that's what you're hoping that they're at least setting up, even if they don't have like a nice, mature, detailed document here.
Yeah. An Excel spreadsheet that they use to track risks.
I think, and actually you touch on an Excel spreadsheet. I think that's really powerful. People often sneer at Excel spreadsheets, and I'm a maths guy, so I love a spreadsheet. But one of the things people look at is they say, they're not that nice to look at. The tabs can go on forever. You can almost have an infinite document in there. But one of the key things about risk management is this is never done. And so I don't want a document that, after 6 months gets closed or gets archived or gets put somewhere, because we're going to need to go back and review that stuff. So what risk we may have mitigated 6 months ago, the landscape might completely change, at which point I thought that was fine. Actually, the risk has gone back up.
Yeah, so, it's part of your risk management process. Every 6 months or a year, whatever your risk appetite is, you want to go through what's sitting in risk treatment, or your closed risks, and review some of those and say, are they still closed? Do they still apply? Have we still got the mitigating controls that we had? If we'd risk accepted and closed them, are we still in a position where we're still risk accepting these,
Yeah.
or has anything changed within the business? Because 6 months to a year in a small business is a long time.
Definitely, and I think that's where things like revision history are so important. So it's having some sort of document tracking capability to say, okay, we're supposed to, look and review these documents over this period of time. Has it actually been reviewed? Who's reviewed it? What comments have they made since it? What changes were made in that time? Because then you know if a thorough risk management process is being followed, because you can turn around and say, okay, well, 6 months ago, the political landscape changed or the economic landscape changed. And so that might be separate to our organization, but those are factors that should have changed the risk, the risk scoring of this.
I know you're talking about measuring risk, but one of the effectiveness, but one of the points that I'm going to add in here, which is a slight tangent, but it's making sure that the risk processes are set up for other teams. So let's say I create a risk and I send it over to T's team. Do they have a risk management process where they're actually looking at the risk tickets and something is happening? Or do they just sit in risk identification for the next 3-6 months until my team then goes and looks at how many tickets are in risk identification? And I see everything I sent to T is still sitting there because the processes are not there.
Yeah.
So setting up those processes across the business, not just within security, that has to be a measure of success.
Definitely. No, that's really important as well. I think the next one is all around compliance. And I think the key thing here is, again, you're not going to be compliant overnight, but you want a steer from this person about, okay, what are the relevant compliance frameworks here? What are the things we need to do? And what are the things that are beneficial to us to do? So, for example, we mentioned about industry-specific standards, things as well that are, location-specific things. So you might be the DPA. Okay, we need to be compliant with the DPA, or we need to be compliant with PCI DSS. Fine, those are things that we need to bake into our plans. But then there's the optional side of things. So things like the ISO standards. And so you have things around information security, business continuity and disaster recovery, quality management, those kind of things. Now, those aren't mandatory to comply with, but actually can provide your business with significant benefit. So if you're a provider of services and you process data on behalf of some of your customers, there's information security expectation there. So, when you want to be onboarded as a supplier for these customers, if they're a mature organization, they're going to grill you about your data security processes, procedures, etc. So actually it's highly beneficial for you to be compliant with something like ISO 27001 for information security management. That's where you want that person coming to you and saying, okay, this isn't mandatory, but this is going to provide us this level of benefit. It's going to take X amount of time to complete. I'm going to need X number of resources to be able to complete it. But in doing so, it's going to help us when we are, going through like supplier vetting, and it's going to make that process a whole lot easier. And you go, okay, we potentially are getting onboarded into 10 teams a year. That's going to save a significant amount of time and resource in doing so. So yeah, the compliance part's really important. Next, it's all business alignment. So like you mentioned there about, connecting to other teams. Okay, great. In our team, we're articulating risk and we're tracking risk really well. But not all of those risks apply to us. It's other areas of the business that need to actually go and implement changes. So how are they dealing with risk? What are they doing about it? So it's not just setting up risk processes within the security team. It's checking how other areas of the business are handling this, so that you have confidence that, like you said, if you raise it to me, my team are going to action it in a consistent manner. It's not, I'll put it on the backlog and hopefully 10 other tickets don't drown it out.
That's another job your risk manager, risk lead will do, is making sure they've got those dashboards where they're tracking risk within different teams and how long they're sitting within the different stages. Yeah. So if you've sent, generally when you create a risk ticket, it gets created under risk identification before it moves into risk analysis and what that means in terms of likelihood and impact. Do they just sit in the other teams for risk identification for months at a time? Or do you have SLAs around that where you're chasing them to say, hey, you've got risks 10 risks outside the SLA of 30 days that you want things being moved from identification to another phase. So it's making sure you have those processes defined clearly and communicated across all the teams.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, that's the final point, right? Effective communication. You've got to make sure that people are aware of what is going on here. What is the risk management program? How are things actually being translated across the organization? But yeah, that's the way that you can, build out this GRC function, but then also track the success of it and, see if it is moving in the right direction or if you need to, shift the way that things are being done there. But yeah, that gives a good introduction to GRC, I guess.
Yeah, I think from a governance point of view, what I've always had success in is generally monthly governance meetings with the senior leadership team to feed back into, this is what we're working on, this is the progress, this was our timeline, and this is where we are with that. If we've come across any hurdles, what we're doing to overcome them, and then readjusting the timeline and making sure the leadership buy into whatever we're taking, and that's being tracked by them, and we're showing the improvements that we're making and the value that security is bringing to the whole business.
Yeah, definitely. It's my biggest pet peeve when I have, especially virtual meetings. Physical meetings are one thing. When you have virtual meetings, right, and you might be on there for an hour, 2 hours, there's no clear agenda, and then there's no clear outcomes from it. That's 2 hours of my life wasted, right? I need to be going in there. There's a clear agenda of things that we are tracking. There's something that we're looking at and we're going, how successful, how much have we delivered to those objectives? And then based on this meeting, what are the actions? What are the outcomes from this? What are we going to do about what we've discussed here? And, mature, successful programs have a clear agenda and a clear actions, outcomes, etc. You love lists and agendas, and
I do. I love a good agenda. Don't go into a meeting without one.
Exactly, because
even before, when I came to talk to T here, we had a conversation outside, and I had an agenda of things that I wanted to talk to you about.
Otherwise we're just chatting, and we can go off on tangents, and 2-3 hours can just disappear, and you go, we've never actually discussed anything important here. But having that agenda, these are the points we need to cover. These are the outcomes that I need to get to. And so based on the discussion we've had, these are now my actions, your actions, blah, blah. And when we next meet, you're going to hold me accountable for those actions.
Where are we at with this, T? So I hope that was a good introduction to GRC and T's pet peeves and how you can begin implementing GRC within your organization. If you have any follow-up questions to this, please do reach out to us via comment on YouTube, comment on Spotify, reach out to us via email addresses on our website. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions or even additional episodes based on popular questions. But if you need some guidance, feel free to reach out to DGF9 for some consultancy work as well. We'd be happy to help. We don't tend to do much with compliance at the moment, but we can definitely provide some advice and guidance. And thank you for listening to another episode of the CyberPod. I've been Kash.
And I've been Tariq. We'll see you on the next one.